Okay, welcome back. So in the last tutorial, we did a tour of the interface, kind of where everything is, and I made this beautiful piece of artwork that is going to win me awards and fame, and I'm just going to be the most celebrated artist in all the world. So let's go ahead and move on to the next tutorial. So what we're going to do is we're going to use some assets that I pulled down from the Library of Congress website. So if you've never been to the Library of Congress's website before, it's a really great source for historical imagery and other things. So I'm going to go ahead and navigate there really quick just to show you that. So you could either search for Library of Congress, or it's the URL is really simple. It's loc.gov. When you go to the site, there's a whole bunch of options here, and it may be confusing as to where you need to go to do things, because there's a lot going on through the Library of Congress. But what you want to do is you want to click on Digital Collections. And within the Digital Collections, they have some featured collections, and then they have this list here. And if I go all the way down to the bottom of the page here, you can see that I can put in as many as 160 results. And I can also go through, I'm going to change from gallery view to list view. I'm going to hit go. And then that gives a bit more information. I find it easier to pay attention to each thing that's going past. And then I'm going to go ahead and say 150 results. And I just want to show you that there's there's a lot out here. So first there's the Farm Security Administration stuff, but there's a huge collection of prints, photographs of all sorts of resources, people's papers, and other things. But if we just scroll down a ways, one of the collections I've used stuff from before is this baseball sheet music collection. The covers are totally incredible. The baseball cards are pretty amazing. There's other stuff, and some of these collections don't have too much that's available to use if you download them, but I'm going to go to one that I know does have stuff. So there's these cartoon drawings. We can do this one. So if I click on this cartoon drawings collection, you'll see that they have featured content. But if I click on this other tab here, there's the collection items, and you can kind of go through and see thumbnails of all the different items they've got. Man in Pool of Blood. Let's take a look at that. If I select that, you'll see that I get a little preview here, and I've got this JPEG here, but if I click on this, you'll see I can get more stuff. Now this is a really small image, and so even the high resolution version isn't all that great necessarily. But if I click on this, you can see a little bit closer. You can zoom in, zoom out, and things like that, right? But you can go ahead and download any of these things for free. Most of these are absolutely public domain. You can use them however you want. I'm going to go ahead and jump forward a chunk and see if I can find some other ones in here. So some are color, some are black and white, and not all of them are downloadable, but most of them are. Right, and so with this one, you can see the TIFF image is 74 megabytes in size. That's huge, right? If I click on this image, we can see it. They actually even have color swatches so you can get your white balance right and everything. But, right, I don't know why I would want to use this cartoon in particular, but there's a huge amount of stuff out there that you can draw from. It's a really great pool of images. Okay. So I'm going to go back to Photoshop, and if you're taking this course through Iowa State, I do have the assets in a folder in SciBox in one of the modules. Sorry, not in SciBox. If you're taking this through Iowa State, these assets are already on Canvas in the module. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my base file. So I'm going to say File, Open. And what I want to grab to start with is Humpty Dumpty, which I accidentally forgot to move over here. So I found this old Humpty Dumpty book on the Library of Congress, and I pulled down all the pages of it. All right, but what we're going to do is we're going to be using the cover, and we're actually going to pull Humpty Dumpty off the cover to use in other images. And we could do it with the text as well, and there's a lot of other things we could potentially do with this. Okay, so I'm going to grab that. Notice I downloaded the TIFF version of it. I'm going to hit open. And now that I've gotten this open, this is my full-size image. And notice it is still a TIFF file, right? Even though Photoshop Documents is a Photoshop file format, Photoshop can pretty much open every image format and many video formats without any issue whatsoever. Right? It's really great in that way. And so today what we're going to look at is selection tools. And so there's a couple of options in terms of our selection tools. If I come over here, you'll see I get this little help thing that pops up, right? But the rectangular marquee tool does exactly what that little icon shows it doing, which is, right, draws a rectangular selection shape. If I hold down on my mouse button while I am on this, you'll see there's also an elliptical one, right, which allows me ellipses, single row, and single column. The single row and single column means it just grabs one row of pixels. Now, those are really useful if there's like a white edge or, you know, something on the edge of your image that you don't want, and you just want to be able to select that off and get rid of it, right? And, you know, they're usually not that useful, but there's occasions when they're good to have. However, there are other selection tools as well. But let's start with the marquee, right? Let's say we want this Denslow's text selected as one block with its background. And so let's go ahead and we click and drag to select this. Now, and you'll notice I accidentally got a little bit of the D in Dumpty. So if I go ahead and zoom in, and by the way, to zoom in and out, you either hit Command plus and Command minus, or Control plus and Control minus if you're in Windows, or you can hold down Option and use or Alt on your computer and use the scroll wheel to scroll in and out. That gives you a bit more fine-tuned levels of zoom than using the plus and minus buttons, the Command or Control plus or minus. So I've zoomed in, and you'll notice that I failed to select this as well as I wanted to. I don't want that D in there. So if I hit Escape, nothing happens. In order to deselect something in Photoshop, you have to hit Command or Control D to deselect. You can also just, if I have a selection area here and I've made a mistake, I can also just click once and that will also disappear that selection area. Right? So let's say I want to select this Denslow, so I'm just going to try and get it a little closer. Okay, so I've selected this. Now, what can I do with a selection area? There's several things you can potentially do. I could actually fill this in. I could grab my paintbrush and I could actually paint and only paint within the selection area, right? And there's several other things I could do within this one small selected section of the image. Now, typically, what you would want to do before you do any of that is make this this selection area its own separate layer. That way, if you make some changes and screw something up, or you're not happy with the results, you can always go back to the base image and make a selection again and redo the work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this into a new image and to a new layer. And to do that is pretty simple. It's the same as you would copy and paste anything in a text editor or whatever. I hit Command or Control C, and then Command or Control V. And when I do that, it will paste this little selection area into a new layer. So if I turn the visibility of my background off, all I should have left over is this Denslow's text here. Now, one of the issues is now that I've got this layer, let's say I also wanted to select Humpty Dumpty and have that in its own layer as well. So I'm going to go ahead and use my rectangle marquee tool again. I'm going to click and drag and select this, and I didn't select any other text unintentionally. So I've got this selected, and now I'm going to go ahead and try and copy this and try and paste this. Now, when I do that, you're going to notice something is wrong. There's this one weird line that shows up, and actually that's an indication that something else went wrong as well. But let's go ahead and let me try this one more time. So this time I'm going to, because what I'm trying to do is show you when a big error happens. Let's go ahead and say I'm actually going to select the publishing information down here. And there's a reason I'm doing it down here. So I'm trying to select that. So I'm going to go ahead and hit copy, Command or Control C. Now, this is what I was trying to have pop up. What it says is could not complete copy command because the selected area is empty. Well, it looks like I'm selecting this thing in the background. However, I actually have layer 1 selected. This is a really common mistake, and I want you to know how to get past it because it's so common and it could hang you up forever if you're like, I can see stuff there, there's something there, but there isn't anything on this layer because the only thing on layer 1 is that text that we just copied up top. So you can hit OK, and then all you need to do is select the layer you want to copy from. So in this case, the background. And now if I hit Command or Control C and then Command or Control V, I should not get an error. And now I've got this second layer where, right, I've got one layer that holds this, and I've got another layer that is holding the word Denslows. So I've got all of that set. So now we should look at some of the more complex and in some cases interesting selection tools. Okay, so first, one thing we can do is let's say we wanted Denslow's Humpty Dumpty all as one thing, but we wanted it to be essentially like a stair step of selection. So how do we do that? So first, we want to make sure we're on the background layer. Then we want to say select, make our first selection, right? So we've selected Humpty Dumpty. And then what we need to do is we need to add to this selection, right? We want to be able to also click and drag to select this. If I just start clicking and dragging up here, it's going to get rid of this previously selected space, right? It's not going to do any damage, but right, it just disappears as soon as I try and do this. All right, so I'm going to hit Command D to deselect that. I'm going to go ahead and pull this out here. And so I want to also be able to select Denslow's. And so if you come up to the tool options, you'll see that there are these 4 little boxes here. One of these is just a single box. That's the default, and that means new selection. If I come over to this one, that means add to selection. So whatever I currently have selected, it's going to add to that. This other one is subtract from the selection, and this final one is intersect with the selection. So in this case, I want to add to the selection. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this box, and you'll notice that if I zoom in this way, you'll notice that I have a little plus sign now next to my Marquee tool there. And that means I'm adding to the current selection. Now, we're going to talk about adding and subtracting a bit more when we actually go to select this guy down here. And so we're going to click and drag, and I'm going to make sure these 2 selection areas intersect, because if they're just like, if they're one row of pixels off, there's going to be a little gap between them, and I want these to be connected. And so I'm going to make sure those intersect. I'm going to let go, and then it joins those 2 selection areas together. And so now I can go ahead and hit Command C and Command V, or Control C and Control V to paste that. And if I actually zoom back out a little bit, you'll see that now I have layer 3. Now, when I just have my layers labeled as they are now, it's going to start getting really confusing because I can't possibly see what's on this thumbnail. Sometimes it's a little more obvious, but right now it's not. And so just having them numbered isn't really very useful for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to double click on my layer, on the name of the layer, and you'll see that allows me to rename it. So layer 3 is, I'm going to call it full title. Layer 2, I'm just going to say pub for publisher. And layer 1, I'm going to double click on, and I'll just call it Humpty. All right, so we've got Humpty, pub, and full title. All right, so we can rename our layers to whatever they need to be. So we've done a couple minor selections. Now, the next thing that we need to do is, let's say we want to do a more complex shape. Like, let's say we want to select Humpty Dumpty out of the background of this image, and we want Humpty Dumpty to be able to be placed in some other scene, which is, in the end, what we're going for right now. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to use one of the more interesting tools. Now, historically, the moment that the Lasso Tool became available, which basically lets you do like a free form selection area, right? I can just click and drag, and it draws a selection area wherever the shape was. I'm going to deselect that, right? That was a game changer once upon a time. So you could actually come in here and select these, complex shapes, but you had to go in and manually do all of these lines by hand, and that was really tedious. Then along came the quick selection tool, and as you can see, it does more thinking, right? And so if I click on the quick selection tool and click inside his hat, you'll notice that something really crazy happened where it didn't work at all. And why is that? It's because I was on the Humpty layer, which doesn't have him on it at all, right? It just has that text, so I need to go back to my background. And I'm actually going to go ahead and hide these other layers for the time being, because we do not need them. So I'm going to go back to the background, and so now if I was to click and drag right inside his hat, you can see that it does a better job of selecting this area, but it's not perfect, right? It's not quite, working all the way through here. It's a little bit off over here. So I'm going to go ahead and deselect that for now. But it was a huge step in the right direction. And as a note, you see the brush head on this is really small. If I go ahead and use the opening or closing brackets, I can adjust the size much like I would with a brush, right? And now if I was to click and drag, it can do a much better job. It takes a larger, what's called a sample. So, right, these colors, there's a ton of different variation in color on the surface because it's old and aged. And so this wider sample range helps clean it up a little bit. And so that helps, but it's still tedious, and there's oftentimes little tiny edges in here that won't be selected, and you won't notice that until you go to paste it, and then there's like a gap somewhere. So I'm going to go ahead and deselect that as well. And we will actually be using the quick selection tool to refine our selection here in a second. But what we want to use is this new tool that came out in a couple versions ago called the Object Selection Tool. So the Object Selection Tool actually uses some math and some decision trees in terms of a piece of software and some artificial intelligence to figure out what the object is you want to select. And so I'm going to use the Object Selection Tool, and then all I have to do is kind of roughly outline Humpty. So I'm just going to click, I'm not anywhere near, right? This is like when you're trying to cut, an object out of a piece of paper. And so you do it roughly at first and you slowly refine it, right? So we're going to go ahead and try and select this entire Humpty Dumpty. And, the important thing is we want to make sure those black edges are outside the lines and all of this. And it'll take it a little bit to think. And then you'll see that it does a decent job. Now, it's not great, right? This edge isn't exactly where I want it to be. There's a lot of these black pixels that are still outside of it. And for some reason, this wand did not get added onto it as well either. So now if I hold down the Shift key, I'm going to zoom in a little bit in here just so I can, so you can see this icon larger. If I hold down Shift, that gives me a plus sign. If I hold down Option, it gives me a minus. And so this is another way that you can add and subtract without going up and clicking on those little boxes up at the top. You can just hold down Shift to temporarily add to a selection. And so if I click and drag, around here, Now I've gone and I've actually very successfully added the I don't know what that is that he's got, a wand, a cigarette, but I don't know. Right, and so you'll see I also have this area here that needs to be selected. So I'm going to go ahead and try to add this with this tool and see if it figures it out. It did an all right job, but it didn't do the best job ever. And so I'm going to go ahead and change tools. I'm going to zoom out. Whoa! I'm going to zoom out all the way. I'm going to go ahead and grab my quick selection tool, which is underneath the object selection tool. So if I click here and pull down, now it says object selection. And I'm going to zoom back in again so I can get a little bit closer to Humpty. And you'll see that now if I hold down, I believe this is automatically set to add. Let's go ahead and check. Yeah, so by default, this is set with the plus here. If it's not set there for you, go ahead and set that up. And I'm going to zoom in a bit and actually zoom in on the pixels a bit too. Right, so I can see a little bit better. And you can see that this whole thing needs to be added to it. So all I'm going to do is I'm just going to click and drag in order to kind of give Photoshop a hint of what I want selected. And then I'm going to go ahead and come up a little bit more. Sometimes if you just click once, it'll actually select more. Now up here at the tip of the hat, if I was to add to this selection, I'm going to be selecting a lot of stuff I didn't intend to select, right? And you'll notice that even on this edge over here, some of these pixels, even though you and I can see them pretty clearly, got selected on accident. And that part of that is because my brush is so big. So I'm going to shrink the size of my brush using the opening bracket. And now instead of adding to this selection, I want to subtract from it. So I want to hold down the Option or the Alt key. And it's hard to see the little minus symbol in the middle, but on your screen you should be able to see it. And then I can just click and kind of draw a little bit and reduce some of those pixels that I accidentally selected. And you may think that this is tedious, but trust me, it's much better than it used to be. Okay, so I've done that. And so I'm going to go ahead and try and do this top part. But right now, you'll note that I can't slide my mouse over here to get any further over. And so there's a couple ways I could continue to move. First, there's the hand tool, which is the letter H. And the hand tool, all it moves is your view of the image you're working on. It doesn't move anything in the image, it just moves the view. The other way to be able to navigate around an image, instead of just using the hand tool, is to use the scroll wheel. And if you use the scroll wheel, you can scroll up and you can scroll down on the image. If you hold down Command on the Mac, and I believe Control in Windows, and use the scroll wheel on your mouse, you can scroll from side to side. If you're using a trackpad and you don't have like a scroll option in that way, although 2 fingers and Control might work, but it may also bring up an options menu. If not, just hit the letter H on the keyboard. Then you can use the hand and you can just click and drag to pull yourself wherever you need to be. And then you can switch back to the quick selection tool. Now, these selection tools, the quick selection and these other ones, the magic wand and the object selection, you use the letter W to access those. So that's the quick key. So I can hit W, have this tool back. I can hold down Option now because I want to get rid of this stuff I selected. And I can just kind of click and drag. And anywhere these things, they call these dancing ants. Anywhere these dancing ants are, I just want to click and drag to get rid of them. And I'm going to hold down Option and click and drag again. And you'll see that, you know, I went a little bit too far in some places, not far enough in others. So I'm just going to sneak that in. And then without holding down Option, because I want to add to the selection, I'm going to go ahead and click a couple times at the tip of the hat. And now I'm going to go ahead and work my way around the rest of his shape. And, you know, usually it should do a pretty good job without like a lot of, you know, time and energy to do this. But, you know, having done this image once before, I know that it's just For some reason, there's the amount of noise on this image makes it challenging for Photoshop to work on this. So I'm going to come back in. I'm going to check. Basically, it's good to check all the way around all the edges, and so I'm going to go ahead and click there, and click there, click here. Hold down Option because I have a little bit excess here. And other than that, it looks pretty good. I'm going to scroll down and make sure his foot is also good. Okay, so I've got this basic shape outlined and selected. Now, I know from experience that this is going to result in a reasonably rough cutout that when I paste this into another image, it's going to not look okay. And I just noticed as well that the bottom of his hand is not selected, so I'm going to go ahead and select that as well and click. All right, so the amount of time it took us to do this is minimal compared to how long it would have taken us to do this, 10 years ago. Okay, so I've got him completely outlined. But now what I need to do is I need to refine the edges of that selection. So I'm going to zoom in until he's more or less full screen, right? Which for me was like 120%. And you'll notice that while I have a selection tool selected, I have a couple buttons up here I can click. The one I want is Select and Mask. So I'm going to click on this. And when I do that, what's going to happen is it's going to give me this red overlay that is on top of the image wherever it's not selected. And it's going to give me a series of settings over here and a very small subset of tools over here. Right? There's still the quick selection tool, but now there's this refine edge brush and a brush tool. And then we have the object selection and some other selection tools as well. Right? And we can zoom and we can use the hand tool as well. Right? So it just cuts out everything that we don't need. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit because I want to show you what the issue is, right? So we did this selection, but we've got these areas where it's still not quite right? There's these little bits of background that come through. And if we put that on some other colored backdrop, they're going to show through and it's going to be really obvious unless this object is tiny in the image that we're going to be placing it in, which we're going to make him reasonably large. So we're going to want to clean those up. And so there's a couple ways we could clean those up. First, we can use the brush tool. And if I use the brush tool, and I'm just going to click in, I'm just going to draw a line kind of across the hat to show you what happens. I'm just going to click and draw. And so by default, the brush tool will select more stuff. I'm going to hit Command or Control Z to undo that. If I hold down Option, right, that's going to do the opposite. So it would deselect, right, anything in red's deselected. So it would deselect that area across the hat. The other thing I can do with this brush tool is, if you remember, I can, just like a normal brush in Photoshop, I can adjust the hardness of this selection. I can adjust the size, the spacing, all of those other things, right? So I might want to make the hardness a little bit lower. Maybe I'm going to make it 82% or something like that. And I'm going to hold down Option, and I'm going to click and drag and just try and paint this in, right? Now, I'm only going to be doing this in areas where it's really outside the lines, right? Where I really messed up a little bit. And if I mess up a touch here, I'm going to undo it. Oops. Undo it. I'm going to hold down Option, click and drag. All right. And what's nice about this is, you can take forever doing it. But really, I'm just looking for areas where there's big problems. So I'm going to zoom in a touch more. And you can see that, in this corner, there's some problems. And there's just a single row of pixels here. So if I hold down Option and click and drag, you can see that I'm cleaning some more of that up. And I went a little bit too far, so I'm just going to click to pull this back. Now, I left a few pixels there, and I left a few pixels here. And I'm doing that for a reason, because I want to show you the other options we've got. If you're so the other thing you'll notice, right, there's a couple big errors here. So I'm going to go ahead and hold down Option and just click and drag until the red starts to touch the black edge there. I'm going to do the same thing here. Okay. All right, so I've done a pretty good job around most of this. Let's go back up to this area where there's this little halo of pixels here. Now, there's likely to be little sections that have 1 or 2 pixels of this blue background that still show through. And so what I want to do is I want to be able to shrink this or move the edge of this selection. And so to do that, I'm going to come down here to these settings where it says Shift Edge. And I'm going to go ahead and pull this down in the negative direction. As I do that, notice that the edge of my selection begins to come into my black line a little bit. And you'll notice that in some cases, right, those blue things are still there. So I'm actually going to go back to 0, and you might say, and I might be like, oh, well, I should probably hold down Option, and maybe I should fix some of these so I don't have quite so much space in here, right? And once I've fixed those all a little bit, they should all disappear when I do this. But I just want to shift this edge in just enough so that there's no chance that any of that color is going to be showing up on the outside, right? So I've shifted it a little bit to make it smaller. Something else I can do is to smooth the edge, right? So I can actually increase the smoothness here. And finally, you can add contrast, which basically hardens that edge some. You can see how hard that seam got now that I've done that. I'm going to reduce that back down. You can also feather the edge entirely. And feathering just means making it go from fully opaque to transparent over a certain distance, right? So if I crank it way up, that's going to be way too big. That's 1,000 pixels. That's right. You can see that it goes from being, if I zoom out, so I'm on this, you can see that right now this selection is really hazy, right? This is the only thing that's going to be, if I was to copy and paste this to a new layer, this would be 100% opaque, but it would slowly start becoming more and more transparent as it got further from that center point. So this is far too big. Usually, right, 2.5 pixels, 3, maybe 4 pixels is just enough to make that seam, when you go and add it into a new composition, it makes that seam just a little bit softer. And it makes it less obvious that it has been added to that it's something that's been added instead of being there all the time. Okay, so I've done that. So now there's a few options here. The other thing I can do is I can invert this selection, so I can actually use this, select the subject, and then I could switch and have the background selected. That's not what we want to do. I don't want to clear this selection. There's this output to, by default, it should be output to selection. Eventually we'll talk about layer mask. There's also new layer with layer mask, new document with layer mask, right? So we have a lot of options here for how we take this and bring it out of here. And so we know that we want this to be a new layer. And so we're going to go and say, click on new layer, and then hit OK. And when we do that, it has now automatically turned the visibility of the background off, and it's dropped this layer in here. And so you can see the feathering on the edge. It almost looks like a shadow right now, right? But it means that, and maybe I went a little bit too much on the feather, but that's okay. And it's something we can go back and work and tweak and work on. Okay, so we've got Humpty, we've got some text in here, and we've done some pretty complex selections. So let's go ahead and look at how to duplicate a layer, and then we are going to recolor some of the, we might recolor some of the sections in here because we're just gonna look at other selection tools that we've got, and then we will add one of these to a new image. So I have this background copy layer, right? I'm just going to call this Dumpty because we already have Humpty. So I'm going to have Dumpty, and I'm going to right click on my layer. And once I right click, there's a bunch of options that come up. And we'll cover a lot of these options as we go further forward. But what we're going to do is right now is we're just going to go to duplicate layer. And I'm going to call this, sure, we'll call it Dumpty Copy. And hit OK. And so now I've got two versions of Humpty Dumpty, right? And so let's look at how we can move a layer. And then we will edit one of these layers. So I have Dumpty Copy selected. And now I'm going to go up to the Move tool. That's the very top tool on the left-hand side of the sidebar here. The letter V is the quick key for the Move tool. And if you use any software in any Adobe program, V is the quick key for the Move tool. And so now I can click and drag and I can move Humpty Dumpty, right? So now we've got two options. I can move them around. I can actually use this to scale this layer, right? Which scaling just means making it bigger or smaller. So if I click and drag, I can, on the corner, I can scale Humpty Dumpty up and down in size. If I hover just outside the corner, I get these two arrows with a bend in the middle, and that's a symbol for rotate. So I could also rotate this layer as well at this point, right? Now, once I do any of those moves, I'm doing something called transforms, right? I'm transforming the position or rotation or size of the layer. And whenever I do that, if I go and try to then, say, use the paintbrush or something like that, well, in this case, it actually just updated. But sometimes it'll give you an error or it'll give you the no sign because you have to set the layer first. And so if I go back to my Move tool and let's say I rotate him again, in order to set a layer after I've made these transforms, I just hover over it and double click. And that will set the layer in the new location, right? Or the new position. And you don't have to do it if you're moving it, but certain other transforms require you to do it before Photoshop will let you do anything else. And we'll look at an example of that here soon. Okay, so I've got these two Humpty Dumptys. And so with this Humpty Dumpty, I want to show you one more selection tool, and then we can move on. So one of the other selection tools is the Magic Wand tool. And this is a tool that allows you to sample a certain color or group of colors and make a selection based on those colors. So let's go ahead and select, to start with, I'm going to select his arm. Now if I click on this, you'll see that it's a crazy looking selection area. And that's because it's selecting everything in this 3x3 pixel grid, which if I go ahead and zoom way in, like all the way in as far as I can go, right? These are the individual pixels. And so a 3x3 grid means it's basically taking a chunk this big and it's evaluating what colors are in there and it's making a selection area based on those colors. If I go ahead and increase this, so I go up to, let's just say, let's say 31 by 31. I'm going to zoom out and I'm going to go ahead and hit Command or Control D to deselect that area. I'm going to click again. Now this has selected much more of this arm, right? And if I hold down Shift, I can add to that selection. Now you'll notice when I did that, I ended up selecting a much bigger area than I intended. And that's probably because I ended up grabbing some of these pixels and some of these pixels. And so it went a little crazy. So I'm going to hit Command or Control Z to undo that. And right, you'll see that there's still areas that I haven't done, so maybe I need to, so maybe what I need to do is undo that selection. And I could either shrink this to go to 11 by 11, but I know that's going to mean more of these areas are not selected. The other thing I can do is I can increase my tolerance. So if I make the tolerance, let's say 20, and I click on this arm somewhere again, right, I'm going to get a much cleaner selection. You can see that, you know, I've got much more of this arm selected. There's fewer holes in here that didn't get selected. If I undo that, let's go ahead and try 30 as our tolerance. Right, the higher the number, the more tolerant this selection area is going to be. Eventually, it's going to be too tolerant, and we'll end up selecting all of anything else that's touching it that fits. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Command D to get rid of that. I'm going to go up to 40, and I'm just going to keep going until until I break it, right? So I'm going to deselect that. I'm going to try 50 instead. Right, so 50 gets me a little closer. Like, it'd be nice to get these little bits in here. However, I can always go in with another tool and just select the remains of that section. Now, why would I want to use this instead of using, say, the quick selection tool? The quick selection tool, honestly, tends to be much faster. However, there's something nice about that's still useful about the Magic Wand tool. And one of those things is this option here where it says contiguous. Right? Contiguous means that the pixels it selects have to be touching the other pixels. If I uncheck that and hit Command D to get rid of my initial selection and reselect this, you'll see that I'm getting pixels all over the entire image. And it's pixels that all fit within that color range. Right? And so this can be a way to like quickly recolor things, because then I could come in with my teal brush, and I'm going to go ahead and change this from whatever brush I have to just, one of the default brushes here, right? And I can come in, and as I come in and paint, you'll see that anything that's that orangish color in the whole image is getting recolored. Now you'll see that my hand isn't so, like, I didn't want that much of the hand to go away. So maybe I need my tolerance to be a little bit lower, but I'm going to go ahead and hit Command or Control Z once and twice, and then I'm going to go back to my thing. I'm going to reduce my tolerance down to 40 and click on this and see what I get. You'll see I still have too much of the hand selected because that's a little bit more orange. Right, but this is just another way that you can select things. Let's deselect that, and let's go ahead and try and use the quick selection tool, right? There's a reason they call it the quick selection tool. If I click and drag, look at how quickly it takes his arm in, right? And you'll notice that I don't have as many of the settings. The size of the brush is what says how many pixels to sample. So what's nice, now I can let's go ahead and select both of his legs in this image, which is hard to do because I'm right on top of the other. There's the other one. Right, so I've got both of his legs selected. And then I need to go ahead and select the orange color on his socks. Now, this is a place where I might want to use my Magic Wand tool, because it's going to be easier to click once in each of these than to try and draw in there and get those. But I'm obviously going to want this to be significantly smaller. And I might make my tolerance 30 just in case, and check mark contiguous. I'm going to click on that. Oops. I'm going to hold down Shift to add to this selection. Click on that. Right. So you can see that as long as I don't select the wrong thing, I'm getting this pretty well selected. And you can see that in some of these areas I'm going to have a bit more of a problem. And what really depends is what pixels do I actually select in here, right? If I go too close to one of the edges, I'm going to be getting some of those edge pixels, and then that's going to be problematic for me as well, right? And if it's too hard to see, I can always hold down Option or Alt and use the scroll wheel to zoom in, or hit Command or Control plus or minus to zoom in, right? And so I've clicked on there again, and that did a much better selection there. Now, right, now that I've got all of this selected, and I'm going to go ahead and do his other foot, and hold down Shift, and just select away. Now, I'm a little concerned, yep, but the nice thing is if I make a mistake like that and catch it, I can just undo it. Down here is going to be really tricky because these are so narrow. I'm going to hold down Shift. I'm going to try and get some of that foot in there, and maybe some of those pixels in there. And these are problematic, right? Those few in there, they're going to be too close to black for me to effectively do that. But I'm going to go ahead and do these because I can. I'm going to scroll down a little bit and do these, and then we'll talk about how we're going to get those last pixels. right? And I don't know why we want to recolor this artwork, but we do. So we're gonna do it this way because why not? All right, so I've gotten most of these done except this little gap here. And this is where the lasso tool still becomes useful. So I'm going to click on my lasso tool, which is here. Also, it's the letter L. And by default, it should also be set to add to a selection, but just make sure it is. And so then I can just click and drag around one edge. And then what I need to do with the lasso is you do need to more or less connect the circle. I need to get close to here. And when I do that, I've got this area selected. And if I want to add a couple more pixels, I can always just try and come over here and just circle that and add a few more. Again, if you hold down Option or Alt, you can use the tool to deselect things as well. Okay, so I'm going to zoom back out. All right, so I've got all the orange things except this arm selected. So I'm going to go back to my Quick Selection tool, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and I'm going to hold down Shift to make sure I do have plus set, which it is set that way, and I'm going to click to add this to the selection. Now, I'm not going to do a great job with the rest of that, but I've got all of these things set. So now I can go back to my brush, and I've got this opacity set to 45. I'm going to make it a little bit fuller, and you know what I might try, in order to maintain some of the texture that's on here, right? If I made this 100% opaque and painted on this, all of that texture goes away, right? It becomes a very, very flat looking image. However, if I want to maintain the texture but have that full brightness, what I can do is I can go to normal, and I can go down to, I can start by trying multiply. And if I click on this and drag, now I'm actually making him green because it's multiplying the blue color by that orange color. So I'm getting this green, but you'll notice that that texture is still there. And so maybe multiply wasn't the best option. So I'm going to hit Command or Control Z. And I'm going to go ahead and try, let's try screen. Okay, that's not going to work. That turns it white. Let's try overlay. That makes it more yellowish, right? But you can get the sense that I haven't actually tried this with this before. Soft light, let's see what happens there. It gives me a kind of pasty color. If I do lighter color, that looks really crazy and junky, so we're not going to do that. So maybe none of these work quite like I want them to. I could also try and do normal and adjust my opacity down some, right? So I get this, but there is still that texture there. I could also try multiple passes. So I could say, okay, well, let's do multiply, and let's make this, you know, kind of a light green right now. And then let's go ahead and do another pass, right? And each one of these is making it a little bit greener. So now maybe I could come in here and say, okay, well, let's do, let's try screen and see if that helps. So now there we go, right? So now I'm closer to the color I wanted, but I've still got that texture that's on those sleeves. And, you know, I forgot this other arm, but I can go ahead and just do a couple passes with this. And it looks like screen and then a couple multiplies worked pretty nicely too. So maybe I'll throw one multiply on top of all of that, so it's a little bit closer. Okay, right, so this is a way that we can do selections to modify colors in an object, right? And we can continue to use this to do these things, right? If I wanted to change the polka dots, I can just click, select a polka dot, and then I can use my brush tool and maybe go with magenta. And multiply is probably going to make this really ugly. Well, it just makes it more red. Let's go ahead and do lighten. There we go. Right, so now I've got this like magenta dot on there, right? And I can deselect that. And so you can kind of get a sense of how these selection tools can do several different things. Okay, so we've used selection tools to select out this complex object, to select out some more basic shapes. And now what we'd like to do is how do we get this layer into another file so that we can use it? And you can use either the one that we've done this beautiful recoloring on, or you can use the underlying one. It doesn't really matter to me which you use. But what we need to do first is open the other file that we want to use. And so if we go to File and Open, and I go to the correct folder, there's this image called Senju that I grabbed, which is also from the Library of Congress. They have a huge collection of traditional Japanese prints that are available in really high definition. And so this file is 151 megabytes. It's a big image file. And so we're going to go ahead and open this. And here we go, right? This is the image that we're doing. Like, notice that you can actually see the wood grain in here from the wood block that they used to cut to make this print. It's really gorgeous. And if you zoom in, right, the level of detail before you get to the pixels is really great, right? It's a really beautiful print. And we're going to mess it all up by throwing Humpty Dumpty in the mix. So the way that we move something over here is the easiest way is if we grab this layer, we can drag it up onto here into the window and let go. And Humpty Dumpty shows up in the image, right? So that's the simplest way to be able to bring something that we've cut out from another image in, right? And what this does is it brings it in as a layer that's embedded in this image. So now if I use the Move tool, right, I can drag Humpty Dumpty around this scene anywhere I want him to go, right? He could be running across the bridge. He could be in the water. He could be up in the sky. All sorts of other things. So let's take a look at some other ways we can use selection tools to make composites. So to start with, let's say Humpty Dumpty's crossing the bridge here, right? So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in some so I can kind of see what he's doing. So as a layer, he is, you know, I can't see any of that texture behind him. You know, these are pretty solid colors on his arms and legs. But let's say that I want him to blend a little bit better in with this layer underneath. So the first thing I can do is I can come down here to where the blend mode is, and I can go from normal, darken. I could try multiply. You'll notice that that looks really nice, but it doesn't quite do it. But you get some really beautiful effects, right? We're not really, you know, I don't know if any of these, maybe overlay works, but we don't want it to be, you know, 100% there, right? And maybe hard light works best in this case. You know, he's still like, ooh, that's intense, right? But there's, you know, what's nice is there's all these different ways that we can get Humpty Dumpty in the scene. And, you know, and so if we do multiply, he's, you know, he's too dark. What's nice is we can always change this, but we could also duplicate this layer and hit OK. And then with one of these copies, most likely the lower one, we can, if we do normal, it actually, right, reduces the intensity of the color that was there and makes it fit a little bit better with everything underneath. However, we really do need to desaturate this layer some. And we're not going to cover how to do that right now. You know, we might be able to maybe lighten works or screen works to make it feel more like it's in there. You know what? I think lighten's a good one, right? So I have this one set to multiply and this one set to lighten. And I'd say, granted, it's still, you know, there's still way too much saturation there compared to the rest of the print. But we're on the right track. Okay, so let's say we've got our Humpty Dumptys here, and we want to make sure these stay together. If I hold down Shift, and so I select both of them and right-click, there's a couple things I can do. The first thing is I could group these, but what I really want to do is link these layers. So if I click Link, you'll see this link icon appears here, and now anytime I select one of them, I move both of them at the same time. Okay, so now that we have these two layers linked, we can click and drag and Humpty Dumpty goes everywhere, right? Both layers move at the same time. Okay, so we've got Humpty Dumpty on the bridge, but let's say that we wanted it so that, right, so Humpty Dumpty could be on the bridge, but part of the bridge covered up his foot, or that this little section here, and maybe his wand's over the edge of the bridge, but his knee, we want to make sure that these are behind the bridge. So let's go behind the railing anyway. So let's go ahead and try and do that. So I'm going to select my background. I'm actually going to hide both of those layers. I might want to look at it again just to make sure I'm getting the right section. And I have a couple options here, right? So I could try and work on this on the background, or what I could do is create another layer that is just a small chunk of this, and then I could work within that layer, which might be a little bit easier to do. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go ahead and say I've got my background. I've got this one Humpty on here to make sure that I know about where I need. And I'm not worried about anything really above his waist, if you can call Eggman thing, if an Eggman thing has a waist. I'm not sure, but what I want to do is I want to just use the Marquee tool. Oops, hold on a second. Right, I want to come up here, I want to use my rectangular marquee, and I just want to select, you know, anywhere where there's a potential for the intersection between the railing and Humpty Dumpty. And so I'm going to go ahead and copy this. But before I do that, I'm going to turn off the visibility of Humpty Dumpty. I'm going to make sure that I have the background selected. I'm going to hit copy, and so Command or Control C, and then Command or Control V to create a new layer. Now that I've just got this layer, I can focus really only on the details I'm interested in, right? And so what I really want to do is I want to get rid of, I'm going to zoom in so I can see better, and I just want to get rid of everything but the railing, right? And, you know, maybe the bottom part of the bridge here. But a lot of this space needs to be empty. And so to do that in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my quick selection tool. And I'm just going to click and drag. And I want to see, you know, how well this works. Now, obviously that didn't quite do what I wanted it to. So I'm going to hold down Option. And I'm going to deselect, right, everything along here. And because these colors are so close, this is actually giving me, you know, a fair amount of trouble in terms of how I can select this. Now, so I want to try and use something that would give me a bit more control than I have otherwise. And I know even the object selection tool and all of that is going to be problematic because of how much variation in color there is here. So I'm going to hit Command or Control D to get rid of this. Now I'm going to use something called the pen tool. The pen tool is meant to make the things called paths. But what we're going to use it for is to create selection areas. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the pen tool. And you can see that I can either create hard corners or bent corners. What we're going to do is we're going to create hard corners. And the way we're going to do that is we're just going to click once in a corner. I'm going to come over to this corner. I'm going to click again. I'm going to come down to this corner, click again. I'm going to come down to this corner, click again. And then I'm going to finish my object by coming up here until there's a little O that shows up next to the icon. All right, so I've created this path. And then I can just continue on, and I don't know if I need any, you know, and I just need to go basically to the edge of this space here. It doesn't really matter, but I want to go ahead and create that one. I can't remember exactly where Humpty's foot is, so I might turn this layer on and say, okay, I don't really need that, but I really do need to be able to get rid of the background here above this because I want to get his knee to be hidden behind that as well. So I'm going to go ahead and leave Humpty on, but I want to make sure I have the background layer selected again. And so now I just need to come up here and click and come down here, click, and you'll see that, you know, it's not perfect, so if I and we'll talk about fixing that here in a second. but I'm going to go ahead and click up here, and then I'll finish this off by clicking up here in space and then dropping it back down. And I did that so there isn't like a sliver of pixels that I don't intend to have there. Now, this edge, if I zoom in a touch, this edge is a little problematic because it's not quite where I want it to. It kind of angles in a weird way. So what I want to do is I'm going to hold down Command, and I'm going to use my scroll wheel, or I could hit the letter H on the keyboard and use the hand tool, but I'm going to come over here, and you'll notice if I try and use this tool to move a point, it either wants to select it, or if I hover over a place where there isn't a point already, it wants to add one, or it gives me that little asterisk symbol, which basically creates a new section. Now, what I want to do, in the tool I need to use instead of that, is this little path selection tool here. It's the letter A on the keyboard. And what I can do now is I can select this one point, and then I can click and drag, and I can actually move that point around. And so if I move this up a little bit, then it better matches that angle. And the part I'm most concerned about is right where the knee comes through. The toe doesn't really touch the edge of that, so I'm not too worried about it. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom back out now so I can see. And so I've got that path, and I've got these other two paths as well. So if I use the path selection tool and I hold down Shift and select this other path and hold down Shift and select this other path, then I have all of those selected. And you know you have a path selected when those little square things called anchor points, which are the corners, are selected. And now with all of that selected, I can come up here to the top, and I should be able to go back to my pen tool. When I go back to my pen tool with all of this selected, I have several options here. I can make a selection, a mask, or a shape. Right? And so what I want to do is I just want to say make selection. And this allows me to feather these as well. I'm going to feather the radius just 2. I just want a slight amount of feathering. And I want to hit OK. And when I do that, now I've created a custom shaped selection area. And now what I can do is I can just hit delete on the keyboard, or sorry, I'm on the wrong layer. I can undo that last step just because I want to make sure that everything's okay, because I tried to delete this layer. I want to be on layer 1. I want to go back and say selection. I want to make sure my feathers are 2 pixels. I want to hit OK. And then what I want to do is I just want to go ahead and delete those areas. Now, as soon as I do that, what I can do next is come in here and I can take this layer 1, I can drag it above both of those Humpty Dumpty layers, and then I can turn on my background again and turn this other Humpty on and hit Command D to deselect. And you'll see that now, I mean, granted I still have some issues, but now it looks like Humpty Dumpty is on the bridge and behind the railing. Right? So another simpler spot to do this would be up here in the water. Let's say Humpty Dumpty is, halfway submerged in the water here. So what I want to do is I want to grab Humpty Dumpty, and I've already got him here, but let's go ahead and make another. We're going to right click on this and we're going to say duplicate layers, and we're going to just hit OK. And so it's going to create this Dumpty copy 3 and 4, which are linked, and I believe they're linked to each other, but let's find out by dragging this. Yes, okay. So maybe we want Humpty Dumpty to be submerged in the water somewhat. So what we can do is we can go back to the background, and we could either use the same method we just did, which maybe it would be best for our ability to do this, because what we want to do is, let's say we want there to be kind of a wavy shape in front of him. So let's start with our pen tool. And the way that we can create waves is to start with, I'm going to zoom out, and I'm just going to create a really simple box that basically bisects Humpty Dumpty. We can fix where he is in terms of depth here in a second, but I'm just going to create a big selection area here. And really what I should have done is actually have these points a little bit outside the edges of the canvas and these a little bit off the bottom. But it doesn't really matter because we're just going to be layering them on top of each other. So then once I've got that, I'm going to zoom back in. And then what I want to do is I want to add some points on the line where Humpty Dumpty's body hits the surface of the water. So I'm going to go ahead and click, and I'm just going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, let's say 5 points. So I've made my 5 points. And then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to select a tool under the pen tool called the Curvature Pen Tool. And the Curvature Pen Tool will allow me to hover between these 2 points or even on top of one of these points and actually create curves. Right? So if I go ahead and do this, this is going to be like Cheesy Waves 101, but it gets the point across. Right? So now I've created this curvilinear shape on top, and I'm going to go ahead and zoom out. And I definitely have the background selected. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hit Command or Control C to copy. Oops. Actually, before I do that, what I need to do is turn this into a selection. And sure, I'll have a feather radius of 2. And now what I need to do is, hold down, I need to copy and I need to paste. And then with this layer 2, I need to scroll, I need to bring this up so it's above, you know, these dumpties. And what I may need to do is actually take the first 2 and the bridge. Well, the bridge is on top already, but I probably need to grab these 2 and drag them up in the order here. Oh, there's one, and go ahead and grab this one as well. There we go. Okay, so now I've got, and yes, it is super cheesy. I haven't added any sort of like, you know, there's no indication here that that there should be like, you know, an edge or a line or something in here to show Humpty breaking through the surface of the water. You know, because there's this nice black ink line that goes around everything else, and we'd probably want to replicate that because it just sort of looks silly now. Right, but so we've been able to use the selection tools to start to composite these objects into another image. And so then something I haven't mentioned and haven't been doing is it's a really good idea to save very frequently just in case Photoshop freaks out when you're trying to do something and crashes. So I'm going to go ahead and say File, and I'm not just going to save this because I want to keep this senju.tiff file as its own thing so I can always get to that background. I want to save as. And I'm going to go to Save As, and instead of saving it as a TIFF, I'm going to save it as a Photoshop document, and I'm going to call it Senju Dumpty. Sounds like a great title, and it's in the right folder, so I'm going to hit Save. And I'm going to hit OK with this compatibility. It'll take it a second, it'll save, and now I've started to make this composition. Okay, so that's the end of this tutorial, the basics of using pretty much every selection tool we can to create selection areas. In the next tutorial, we're going to look at one other way that you can select things it's a similar but different way. You may have seen all the words mask everywhere, right? So what we can do is we can essentially cover up part of an image, whereas right now we've been extracting something from an image and placing it somewhere else, or just straight up extracting it. Whereas with a mask, it's a non-destructive form, which means that rather than extracting it, you just hide the rest of the image. So you can always come back in and you can modify your mask. And it takes a bit more, you know, it's a more functional way to do this. So with no further ado, I will see you in the next tutorial.